Hi, this is Stan Bush.
Hi, this is Stephanie Calvert.
This is John Payne.
This is Jack Hughes.
Hey everyone, this is Britt Lightning from Vixen.
Hey everybody, this is Prescott Niles.
Hi, I'm Carrie Stevens.
Hello, I'm Kofi Baker.
Listening to Play That Rock and Roll.
This is not a test. This is Play That Rock and Roll. I'm your host, Joe Kay, and today our guest is music journalist Gary Graff. Gary is the editor of the new book, 501 Essential Albums of the 1980s, the music fan's definitive guide. Subscribers might remember that Gary was here last year when he visited the show to promote his previous books, 501 Essential Albums of the 1990s, and Travelin' Man, On the Road and Behind the Scenes with Bob Seger. In this interview, we are talking about my favorite decade of music, the 1980s. First, we cover some of the major music trends of the 1980s and how Gary felt about them during his early days as a music journalist. And since we had both recently seen a band featured in this book, Devo, on their current tour, Gary shares his review of that show. From there, we dive in on some classic rock selections that Gary wrote the reviews for, specifically albums from Genesis, Steve Winwood, Toto, Night Ranger, Alice Cooper, among others. We also discuss why so many 60s artists had big comebacks in the 1980s, and of course I had to ask Gary about what Bob Seger was up to in that era as well. 501 Essential Albums of the 1980s is available wherever books are sold. But before going to Amazon, please consider first checking with your local independent bookstore. Also, be sure to find Gary on Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky. Social media is the best way to find Gary's music articles and concert reviews, which are written for multiple publications. Links are in the description below. And finally, if you're in the Milwaukee area, you can hear Gary's weekly radio appearance on Bob and Brian in the Morning on 1029 The Hog for his segment Music News, which airs every Friday. And with that, here's my conversation with the editor of 501 Essential Albums of the 1980s, Gary Graff. We are here with Gary Graff, who was here last year to talk about the 90s book and also your book about Bob Seger, which is excellent. You're back now to talk about the 501 Essential Albums of the 80s. I imagine that was an extremely daunting task. How did it go?
It went well. I think as you know, the book turned out. It was different from the 90s in that there were more albums to consider, really, and I think we talked about this when we were talking about the 90s. The further back you get, just the nature of the music industry, you had more significant bands releasing a greater number of significant albums almost every year. Yeah. So when we made the spreadsheet for this, I mean, it was 2,600 albums to consider. And a lot of that was just because it was really somewhere during the 80s that the industry got comfortable with the idea that, well, you can take 2, 3, 4, sometimes even more years between an album and not necessarily lose your audience. So things did start to get a little more spread out, but in the 80s, it was very rare to have a Michael Jackson who took, nearly 5 years between Thriller and Bad and things like that. And you still had guys like Prince putting out something every year, REM. There were so many, bands that were just churning them out, and they were churning out really good albums. So the universe of things to consider was really larger this time.
For sure. Is that larger universe also in respect to genres? Was there a larger number of genres that were becoming more part of the pop culture scene that hadn't been seen in previous decades?
Well, definitely in the case of hip hop and
Yeah.
rap, that really, I mean, there was something that was rap around during the 70s, but it was really in the 80s that took off as a genre and electronic music too. It went from something other than Kraftwerk and Tangerine Dream to, to something that was really dance music based. Although within the electronic realm, you had ambient music, you had all sorts of different kinds of electronic music, so you had that going as well, and that's on top of rock, pop, jazz, country, gospel, R&B, which remain, on full cylinders, and thanks to a largesse of money, even more productive in the 80s.
Maybe it's because I'm not the biggest country fan, but I was surprised about how much country music is in these pages, mostly because I always associate country with having a huge revival in the 90s, but
Right.
I imagine, I know that that audience was always still there, and there was a lot of good music in that era too. How would you describe the 80s country music scene?
It was kind of weird. I mean, I think you came off a fairly healthy 70s, and country dropped out of favor in the pop mainstream. I mean, sure, you had Islands in the Stream, Kenny Rogers had his moment, but it was nothing like it would become in the 90s. I think the country as a genre and as an industry really kind of redefined itself during the 80s, and then you get to the later 80s and you start to see the emergence of some other artists, and you had moments. You had KT Oslin, for instance. You forget how big she was for a time in the 80s, and it was definitely a genre. That was a genre in particular that was kind of finding itself. And it really wouldn't be until CMT followed MTV
Right.
onto the air that it began to gain a little traction.
So this decade, this is when you got started as a music journalist, right? These are your early days writing about music. So I have to imagine, you're revisiting stuff you probably wrote about, back when it was originally released, and I'm very curious to hear about how your thoughts and feelings about various pieces of music have changed over time. But I'll start with a broader question sort of on that topic. What were some of the biggest changes in the music industry in the 80s that you noticed at the time, and how did you feel about those changes now, then versus how you feel about them now?
Well, I mean, the hardest change was, of course, my hairline
Yeah,
throughout that decade. That was also, yes, it was the beginning of my post-college professional career. It was also the beginning of the retreat of my hair.
yeah.
So I do remember that. It
Mine
was
was an
interesting.
immediate surrender.
Exactly. Yes, it was a hastier retreat than I would have liked.
Yeah.
Um, but I'd really started noticing it while I was in college, and I was writing about music in college alongside. I was a sports reporter and an investigative reporter, and doing things like that, but kept music on the side. And so my college years, 78 to 82. That's really when punk was turning into new wave and mainstream was opening to. I remember my senior year of college and Human League and the Go-Go's and the Police's Spirits in the Material World and things like that. And you did feel a bit of a changing of the guard and a bit of opening up that it was going. And I came out of college, full of spit and whatever else. And we are not going to like this damn classic rock
Right.
BS. And it's going to be the Clash. It's going to be the Talking Heads. This is what's happening now. And of course, you get your comeuppance a little bit there. But I was noticing the opening in the rock mainstream for new sounds and an appetite. Because we were a baby boom sized populace. of young people at that time, looking, I think, to distinguish ourselves from our older brothers and sisters rock. So while we sometimes maybe grudgingly acknowledge the classic rockers and secretly still like them, those 70s rockers that became the first gen classic rockers, there was a sizable audience looking for its own music, and so gravitating to Talking Heads, and then Joe Jackson, Elvis Costello. I mentioned Human League, and the Go-Go's, the early MTV bands, finding Duran Duran and the Jam, and there was just that whole generation of bands, and some people went harder and found some of the more hardcore things, whether it was Dead Kennedys or really sinking into the Ramones, but just a new generation of rock.
Were there genres of music or artists that were in that new crop that you mentioned that at the time you were not particularly impressed with, but in the years since have come to appreciate and put in this book?
That's a really good question, and I don't think so. I mean, I became one of the nice things about doing music journalism for a daily newspaper is you can't just say I'm going to be a rock fan.
Uh-huh.
So I was having to, I mean, I already liked R&B music, but just the nature of the job, you were paying attention to that. You were paying attention to country. You were paying attention to all the forms of pop music, love them, loathe them, and everything in between. So I can't say there was anything that I necessarily, didn't like at one point and suddenly started to. I think, maybe a greater appreciation for classic country, for
Oh,
70s and traditional countries. I don't know if that's a function of the 80s or just a function of age.
yeah.
You get a little older and some of those country themes make more sense to you. And as your taste matures and you start to appreciate more of the subtleties that are part of country music, the textures and the nuances that you hear in the Flats and Scruggs, or the Willies and Whalens, and all those artists, then you start to have a greater appreciation, perhaps to the detriment of more modern forms of country music. It's like, oh, that KT Osland album sounded good at the time, but now give me the outlaw stuff.
Right. Yes. Yeah, I could tell you I've experienced something similar. I'm 30, I'm about to be 37, and in my 20s I never listened to any country music, but I think in part because of the Highwaymen, which is chronicled in this book, that opened my eyes to, or my ears to, a genre that I actually enjoy a lot more now.
I hope anyone who's listening to this isn't seeing me give you the finger for being 37, for bringing up 37. From my age, nearly double that.
Yeah. Well, well, I mean, by the looks of it, you don't look a whole lot older than me, so I wouldn't worry too much.
Well, you're
Or
very
maybe I
kind.
don't
Well,
look too much younger than you.
nah, let's go with the former.
Yeah,
It's better for both of us.
absolutely. So on that note, I wasn't around in the 80s. I was born in 88, so I missed all this stuff.
You're killing me.
I'm piling on.
Uh,
But it's my favorite stuff. And I think it's my favorite stuff in part because since I've been in high school, I feel that current pop culture has been having this constant an aspect of an 80s revival ever since like the early 2000s. There's always something being remade or sampled or, whatever. So, when you think about the younger generations who only experience 80s music through newer stuff, are there any misconceptions you think that younger fans might have about this era, specifically the 80s?
yeah, I mean, certainly that spandex and hairspray were ever cool.
Yeah.
Really, I remember making fun of people who looked like the prototypical 80s look. See, one of the things, you use the word revival. I argue that the 80s never really went away. That there was a real template there, that was created, in just a pop culture attitude really that was created with the music being everywhere and integrated into every form of our entertainment life. You know, really, first of all, you could have the music anywhere and everywhere. Thank you, Sony Walkman and all the other imitators that came in its wake. Thank you, Boombox.
Yeah.
You could take the music you wanted with you, whereas when you only had your car radio or your transistor, you were at the mercy of the radio programmer. So just that idea that music all the time on your own terms, and then immersed in every piece of culture we had, movies. Great, yes, there was music in movies throughout, but certainly in the wake of Saturday Night Fever, the movie industry saw how important music could be towards the marketing of a film and vice versa.
Yeah.
So, they became joined at the hip. TV, MTV, you can't overstate the impact that had on the music business and on the music and entertainment culture. And it changed everything. It changed advertising. It changed the look. It changed the sound. So that's back in terms of misconception, I think it's really more just that if people take a minute to think about it, the conception might change. The idea, okay, so what was the 80s and what was the importance of the 80s? And it really was that it made music a constant art form in the culture, period.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I one of my favorite shows was Miami Vice,
Oh
and
yeah.
that's a show I think of that set a template for just using pop music uh, to tell a story.
And attitude and the whole attitude of MTV and the artists of the time, the look, the speed at which that show worked, the way it was presented. And you saw that in a lot of TV. It wasn't just a linear plot,
Right.
where you went from point A to point B, but it was a lot more stylized and a little more cut up in its approach.
For sure. So, okay, that's an interesting point. That a lot of this stuff has really never left us. A lot of this music has stayed in the pop culture, but with the passage of time, a lot of stuff just doesn't make the jump. Are there albums in this book that you're at all worried that genuine or that otherwise might be lost to time?
Great question. A little, I think of something like, and it's funny, we were talking about country earlier, but we have like Sweethearts of the Rodeo's debut album in here, and Foster and Lloyd are in here, and a few others that were kind of the early Americana. There wasn't a name for it. I remember going to a concert here in Detroit called, it was a big day long thing. They called it This Country's Rockin'. And because they didn't have the term Americana yet, but also the country genre in particular moved at such speed that it did leave a lot of artists in its dust. And especially once you did have the 90s revolution and the Garth Brooks and Clint Blacks and the Travis Tritts and that whole new class of artists when they arrived, it really felt like there were a whole lot of other artists and very good albums from country that were left behind. Hip hop and rap always stayed sort of reverent to their forebears. They would name check each other
Oh yeah.
all the time. So what was viewed as a classic era of rap is still it's still preserved even today. Even of it in its references, and in rock, the what do you call it, the best rose in rock, and continues to be, and because of the romanticization of the 80s, stays where we're always going to have George Michael's Faith with us. We're always going to have Like a Virgin with us. We're always going to have Born in the USA and Purple Rain with us. So I think if anything, it's a long way around getting to. I think it affected country more than any of the other genres. I don't know that I could necessarily speak to gospel and how, that's because that's a genre that certainly evolved and embraced new sounds. But I do feel like in gospel, anybody listening to a contemporary gospel act kind of knows who Andre Crouch is. And so that's a genre that's kind of respected its elders as well.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a big appeal of books like these is that for someone like me, I love the 80s. That's, again, my favorite music decade. There was a whole bunch of records in here I'd never heard of. But now
Good.
I have an entry point, not just to specific albums, but artists I might not be familiar with. So I'm glad, I'm always happy to see projects like this, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and that is the point of it. I mean, it is hopefully you can hand somebody this 80s book or the 90s book before it and just say, here's what you need to know about music in that decade. And hopefully we're turning people on to some things because 501 albums, even though it comes from a spreadsheet of maybe 2,600, 501 is a lot for any individual person to retain on their go list,
Yes.
even for an entire decade.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, okay, I want to talk about some of the specific albums in this book, but before we get to that, I got to bring up one more 80s topic here
Sure.
because I follow you on social media. I love your concert reviews, and I want to bring one up because you just saw one of the artists chronicled in this book, and I did too, just last week. I saw Devo, and
Oh,
so did
yes.
you. And that was one of the best concerts I think I've ever seen. It felt more like an event than a concert, and I think it's probably just because they don't come around too often. But tell us a little bit about the Devo show you saw, and how important were they back in their heyday of the '80s?
Yeah, Devo is hugely important. They actually came along during the 70s, and they were a late 70s, but they were a complete WTF band at that time. I mean, what are you doing? Rolling Stone Satisfaction. Why does it sound like this? And just the whole kinetic nature of that band and the way they approached music and the whole de-evolution theory,
Yeah,
was, it, you had to get your head around it. It was arty. It was art. This was, in the context of a Frank Zappa, maybe not so unusual in its unusualness,
yeah,
but at the time, very unusual. Yes, very weird. And it really has been a delight to see it because even when they did Whip It, they were still considered the weird boys. When it was out before you were born, I'll say that before you say it.
yeah,
It was still they were the weird guys, and so it really has been a delight to see how well that music has aged and how current it sounds, not just on record, but having both just seen them live, it was a killer concert. They're in good shape. The three remaining members and the two guys with them, they're still in good shape. They still have that goofy affect to them. The costume changes, I admired the cojones that you played Whip It, your sixth song in, half hour into the show, and you're putting your biggest hit there. That shows a real confidence in a catalog
yeah,
to then have yet another hour of music that you have that kind of confidence in. It was I had seen them at South by Southwest, and the five of them were still there, and they were still great. I mean, they really sounded good, and this time, boy, and I expected they would be good, and I wasn't disappointed. And it was fun to be in a crowd. I'm sure you had this experience too, with, how many people still have the upside down flower pot hats that they were bringing from home, not
yeah,
buying at the merch stand.
right.
So the whole Devo world is still really strong, and I'll go back and see them this summer or later in the summer when they come around with the B-52s.
That's crazy that they got the B-52s to just come out of retirement,
They haven't B-52s haven't really retired.
oh, I guess
They
no one
keep
ever does.
they keep talking about it. Nobody should.
Yeah,
And we've seen enough of the bands in this 80s book go on their supposed farewell or final tour. Just don't say it.
yeah,
Yeah, it maybe helps sell tickets, but just go out and tour and, shut up.
yeah.
That's
Call it maybe the last time,
Yeah, play with it, or there's some of them we truly believe, that it will be. There's some of them that it should be,
Yeah,
and
yes.
one of them may be one of the two bands we're talking about being out later this summer. But we'll leave it at that.
Well, we'll look forward to your upcoming review, I'm sure. This book has so many great albums. I tried to just narrow down my topics here to the ones that you specifically wrote about
Uh,
to hone our focus here, because otherwise I think I'd ask you to hang out for 3 hours, and that's too much.
uh,
So I also know you've been hitting the podcast sphere pretty hard, so I'm going to try and be original here.
that's
And I'll start with this question. Have you ever seen the movie American Psycho with Christian Bale?
I did.
Okay. So that movie is very much a reflection on the 80s, and there's a couple of moments in the movie where Christian Bale as Patrick Bateman goes on a little monologue about a various album from the 80s. So I'm going to read the quote to you that he says, and we'll get your reaction to that, and then we can talk about the album proper.
Sure.
So the first one is Genesis Duke, released in 1980. Patrick Bateman says, quote,
Before that, I really didn't understand any of their work. It was too artsy, too intellectual. It was on Duke where Phil Collins' presence became more apparent.
fair assessment?
Pretty fair assessment. It was their poppiest album to date, and they kind of started that track on, and then they were three, after Steve Hackett left the band, and it was as the title says, just the three of them, and then you had Follow You, Follow Me, and it's like, whoa, this is a genuine pop single
Yeah.
from Genesis. What the hell? And then when you did get to Duke, there was still a lot of prog stuff on there, but you had Misunderstanding, and you had Turn It On Again, and song, a lot more melody, some tighter song lengths, things like that. So yeah, I would say that's, and I actually, I remember that from the movie and in the book. I mean, it was
Oh, yeah.
that was very much, I kind of got a smile in there. I think personally think it's a very strong Genesis album, because it did really straddle that line in a nice way. It was nice to have Behind the Lines, Duchess, and then Duke's Travels, Duke's End, these proggy longer pieces kind of bookending the more of those pop type of songs.
Oh, that's interesting. So the strength of the album is the balance between pop and their prog roots. I know Abacab is also in the book,
Yeah.
but perhaps this was one of the big arguments you and your crew had over inclusion. Invisible Touch did not make the cut.
No, not the Genesis people, including myself, but who are involved in the book. We did not feel as successful as it was.
Yeah.
We did not feel it was a particularly good Genesis album. Certainly not as good as Duke and Abacab. And so when you're talking about, okay, what's something that's essential to this, and part of the winding thought process here is essential to also understanding progressive rock and what it did in the 80s. Then we felt like these two Genesis albums, along with the 90215, Yes, and the Asia album, we felt like those were, and King Crimson, with Discipline, those were the albums to us that told the story of prog in the 80s.
Well, that's interesting. I think that's a good point for genre representation. Do you think perhaps another weakness on Invisible Touch is that they lost that same balance we were just talking about, and it's
Yeah,
far more a pop album.
very much so. Even though, you listen to something like Tonight, 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 which was a pop hit, it still has certainly has some proggy elements to it. It just didn't feel like they were doing it as good
Yeah.
as they had done it on these two previous albums.
Okay.
And congratulations, you're the first person to bring that one up.
All right. Well, hopefully I've got a few more here. I got one I know hasn't been brought up before, but before we get to that, one I was super happy to see here because he's one of my favorite guys is Steve Winwood, Arc of the Diver. Of
Yes.
course, Back in the High Life is in there too, but Arc of the Diver is one of my favorites. I guess this is another thing where, a commercially perhaps more successful one was Roll With It, which he had in the late 80s. What made Arc of a Diver special enough to be included in this book?
Just a great freaking album. That was, first of all, it was a comeback. It brought Steve Winwood back into the public consciousness because of While You See a Chance and having a hit with that. But such a strong album all the way through. The song Arc of a Diver, Slow Down Sundown, Spanish Dancer, Dust. These were just tremendous songs. And then the one man, largely one man band nature of it, that he made this album by himself and really was able. He did that on the Steve Winwood album too back in '77,
Oh
but
yeah.
he was able, he really honed it, on this album. It's just a beautiful record. I lump this in a little bit with the same year Roxy Music's Avalon, because these were just beautiful albums. This is the essence of the album. You put it on, and in Arc of a Diver's case for 40 minutes. I forget how long Avalon is, but you just stayed with it all the way through because it was done so beautifully.
Okay, so tell me, how many podcasters have asked you about Fela Kuti, Coffin for Head of State?
Nice. As you can imagine, it's you. And
Okay,
well done.
well
I'll
done.
I'll
Yeah,
I'll,
and
u- I'll
I'm
use I'll use that middle finger I threw before to applaud.
okay. Thank you. Good. All right. But I'm gonna lose the credibility here because so my thing is I know Fela Kuti because of his connections to Ginger Baker and Paul McCartney, so I know a little bit about him, but I know he's, I guess, a huge figure in what we'd call world music. But tell me a little bit about that record. What makes it so important, and why would someone who, like me, is a rock music fan, why would we want to check that one out?
Maybe I call it eat your peas and carrots. It's good for you to hear this. So on one level, yeah, it's the world music aspect of it. I mean, what Fela Kuti did was, I mean that mix of Afro beats, African styles, and then the jazz,
Oh yeah.
that he put into it. I mean, there's a lot of jazz in his sound, and then the social commentary that is part of this. This is one of the most provocative and polarizing figures, in African, certainly in Nigerian history. This is a guy who ran for office, who they tried to assassinate because
Yeah.
he was so provocative. There's nobody other than Bob Marley really who who had this kind of profile and this kind of impact on his land and his society. So, all respect to somebody like Bob Dylan, this takes that type of impact to yet another level.
Right.
But the Afrobeat sound, I mean, there wouldn't have been, even though it came from a different part of the continent, there wouldn't have been a Paul Simon Graceland without Afrobeat,
Absolutely.
and there wouldn't have been, and you had others like King Sunny Ade and people like that. But so yeah, it's an interesting, all of Fela Kuti's stuff is interesting in that it doesn't go down easy, especially the first time you listen to it. But that's why I say eat your peas and carrots and hang with it. And
Yeah.
you really will be rewarded if you spend the time to really submerge yourself in it, and you'll find all those cool things happening, and before you know it, you'll wind up buying more Fela Kuti albums
Yeah, I think so.
or
Especially,
downloading them.
you're right, more likely. Yeah, very cool to see that record there. He was like an intense guy. He was like a political figure.
Yeah,
And let's go way to the other end of the spectrum of maybe some of the least intense guys. Toto 4.
yeah. I mean, you got a big album,
Yeah,
and arguably the album that really coalesced Toto's sound. I mean, the first album, if we do a '70s book, would certainly be in there because that was a great album. This was just a really, I mean, you couldn't ignore its impact. You couldn't ignore the 6 Grammy Awards.
yeah.
And not necessarily my go-to album not even when I'm on my yacht, necessarily to play it, but just a very strong album, very well played, and even getting beyond, the dreaded Africa. And I say that jokingly. There's nothing wrong with Africa other than how often we find ourselves having to hear it.
Yeah.
But you had stuff like Make Believe and Don't Hold Back and Afraid of Love and Waiting for Your Love that were just good pop songs, well played, well produced. You can really hold this album up as, yeah, here's what mainstream pop rock was in the 80s, and that it kind of launched its own weird subgenre, of yacht rock is, also makes it, somewhat important for that reason.
I was just going to say, given that yacht rock documentary that was out last year, and really how much of a resurgence that genre has had recently, I know there's a lot of love now for bands like Toto and artists like Christopher Cross and whoever else. At the time, was Toto as well regarded as they are having this resurgence now, even with all those Grammys?
Not by the cool kids,
Right.
of course, but it was still a multi-platinum album.
Yeah.
It got lots of radio play. The problem of a sort for Toto was it was one of those kind of faceless bands. So it was the equivalent of what Journey and Boston and Foreigner were during the '70s is, because there wasn't a particular person that stood out save for those who knew music and understood what great players these guys were. So there wasn't that connection necessarily made with them as a band, but people love the music.
Maybe on that same note, another one I wanted to ask you about. I was surprised to see Night Ranger Midnight Madness here. Not because I don't like Night Ranger, I do a lot. I've seen him in concert. But when I think of the word essential, I'll be honest, that band doesn't necessarily register for me. And I know that sounds disrespectful. I don't mean it to be, but it's because they're in that category you're talking about, that faceless, like arena rock, corporate rock kind of thing. Was there something about this album that punched them through a little further than others that otherwise didn't make the book?
I think it was a representation of that particular kind of subset
Okay.
you just described. Those type of bands. I mean, yeah, we have a Journey album in here. We do have High Infidelity,
Yep.
from REO Speedwagon in the book. But, I really felt like as a really straight down the line mainstream rock album, of the early part of the '80s, you couldn't find one more representative or better than Midnight Madness, and it had Sister Christian on it, which is an essential track of the '80s. That was one that a contributor made the case for,
Yeah.
and convinced me that okay, and really showed me sometimes when we do have the argument, especially the bands with large catalogs, like which ones are you going to include, or which ones are you going to leave out? A lot of it does come down to a discussion amongst us, and we see who sells it the best.
Yeah. No,
There's
that's
an
interesting.
Yeah, there's an Elvis Costello album in the book I wouldn't have thought would be in the book, but the contributor sold it to me that this was one to include. So
Okay.
okay,
Well,
you got it written already. Just write what you told me, and we've got one done.
okay. I've got three. I'm going to give you all at once because it's more about the connective tissue, I suppose, in the sense
Sure.
that they were comeback artists. Aretha Franklin, Who's Zoomin' Who, Grateful Dead in the Dark, and George Harrison, Cloud Nine. Can you talk?
Wow.
All great, but can you talk about this aspect of 80s music where the 80s music scene where you had legacy acts from the 60s who really didn't do a whole lot in the 70s have big resurgences in the 80s? I know Roy Orbison's another one.
Yeah, I mean, I'll push you back on Aretha. She had a great 70s,
Okay, okay,
you
that's
know,
fair, yeah.
but you're right. She had kind of, you know, that had dissipated somewhat. And I think the lesson in that, and I love that you put these four together. The lesson in that is that talent still wills out. Okay, it's just, in everybody you just mentioned, Aretha, Roy Orbison, George Harrison, who was the fourth one?
The Grateful Dead.
So the Grateful Dead, they're a different story. We'll get to them in a minute, but you know, those others still had the talent, just needed to sound current,
Yeah,
just had to. So when they got with the right producers, Narada, Michael Walden, for Aretha, and we should note Luther Vandross for Aretha in the 80s or in 80. And then you had Jeff Lynne with George Harrison and the Roy Orbison album, and they made it sound like the times.
yeah,
But because of who those artists were, they sounded even better.
yeah.
And so, yeah, the talent just rises to the top. Case of the Grateful Dead, I think that was more a case of they just took the studio seriously for a change, and they went in trying to make a good contemporary sounding album, and took the time to have the goods for that album to write some really good songs. And really, that's one of the Dead albums, like those the albums that got him over during the early part of the 70s. That was the album that the Dead was able to fuse a genuine melodic sensibility that they have as songwriters with their jammy nature. I mean, Touch of Grey as a single was not exactly what is it? It's like a 6-minute song at least.
Yeah.
And so they were able to fuse those things. Yeah, Touch of Grey weighs in at nearly 6 minutes.
Yeah.
And then you just had some good. Hell in a Bucket is a good song. Throwing Stones is a good song, and it did coincide with the real rise of the gradual rise of the Deadheads. So you had by the time you did hit the mid '60s, and this album came out what '87, I think. You did have the generation or the Deadhead audience had even grown. It had added another generation to the mix. So they were ready for some new material as well. So you had a lot of things come into play there. Whereas when George Harrison put out Cloud Nine, nobody was looking for another George Harrison album. He just happened to make a really good album. And there's a good part of the discussion here is the record labels at that point in the 80s had so much money to
Oh,
spend to promote these, to create videos, to make sure that to do whatever they did at radio to mount a campaign and video. So they were able to take a George Harrison, a John Fogerty it happened to during the 80s, Roy Orbison, and play on. They were able to leverage their legacy
yeah.
into a new audience.
That's a good point. I didn't think about that, about the money behind them at that
Oh
point.
yeah.
Uh, so going back to your days as a music journalist in the 80s, when this stuff was happening, just keeping in mind what you told me earlier about these new fresh bands coming in, what did, Gary Graff in 1986 think about some of these legacy artists who maybe your parents liked, coming back into the scene?
Would have been my older brother.
Okay.
And I was cool, totally cool with it. I mean, I was like we were talking about earlier, maybe, grudgingly, or, you didn't want to admit it, but still liked the Grateful Dead and listened to them.
Yeah.
Was happy to see Bruce Springsteen make the ascent he did in the
Yeah.
80s, coming out of that. The more the merrier, and yeah, to see a Roy Orbison get his flowers, to see Steve Winwood, be able to do what he did, to see Paul Simon have a resurgence,
Oh yeah. Yeah.
like he did. Although, well, and you could say this about Steve Winwood, but Paul Simon, Peter Gabriel, these guys found new directions
Yeah.
to really explore and push. It was great. It spoke to the times, and it spoke better of the times because you had these iconic kind of artists rubbing elbows with the newbies,
Yeah.
and that only made everybody better, I
Yeah.
think, and made everybody sound better, next to each other. And the diversity, and I've often been saying in all of these, talking about the book and about the 80s is I feel like there's this moment in the 80s where we were all music fans. Okay. Still had the tribes, of course, but a somebody listening to Metallica's Kill 'Em All
Yeah.
knew who Madonna was and knew who Prince was and knew what their songs were and understood why they were important and popular. Okay, may not have been their bag entirely, but they knew. And I feel like we were all, for that kind of a brief point of time in the 80s, we were all music fans.
Yeah.
And that's something I think I realized doing this book more than I had before.
Absolutely. Yeah. I talk about that with my friends where people even younger than me, they don't have that monoculture anymore.
Right.
Where, things that, yes, stuff that was before my generation, I know a whole bunch about because, reruns and sampling and whatever else. But I know people who, like, if I said, what do you think of the Beatles? They would just kind of shrug and be like, who's that?
Right.
And yeah, that's kind of a bummer. And I that's one of the things that's cool about the 80s is that everybody at least was aware of what was going on. One of the last albums that you wrote about that I have to ask you about because you also put out a book about this gentleman, Alice Cooper. I just saw Alice a couple of months ago. I hadn't seen him in years, but man, he had not lost a step. He was freaking awesome.
He's
And he's kind of invisible in the 80s, right? Up until Trash in 1989. Can you
right.
talk about what his career was looking like in the first part of the decade and what this album meant to him?
Well, in the first part of the decade, he was an addict.
Yeah,
That's when the substance abuse almost killed him. And until he pulled out, he had rehabbed, and then he had relapsed, and then and that relapse was really, hard and deep. The albums had not been good up to that point, and he went away for a period of time, until he reemerged with a couple of albums, Constrictor and Raise Your Fist and Yell, which
great
were
album cover on that
which
one.
yeah, it was, and those were designed to reestablish him with the heavy audience, to show that Alice Cooper could still, rock. Devil's Horn, Fist in the Air, Devil's Horn extended. Those weren't intended to be classic Alice Cooper albums because those classic albums in the 70s were filled with really, really good songs.
Yeah,
So once they kind of reestablished his cred, if you will, and brought him back and started cutting off his head again and
yeah,
and doing all that stuff, then they shifted into Trash, and they put him together with Desmond Child to produce the album, to co-write most of it, and voila, you got Poison and you got House on Fire and Only My Heart Talk and Bed of Nails. He was working with Bon Jovi and some of the guys in Aerosmith, and Kip Winger was in his band at the time, and you got this really well crafted song album that was very similar, and in some cases on a par with Love It to Death or Billion Dollar Babies or School's Out. and then you had a real resurgence. Poison was a big hit single. We wouldn't be that long before he was in Wayne's World. Alice Cooper was in Wayne's World and things like that, and became everybody's favorite kind of Uncle Shock Rocker.
Yeah.
And but part of it was part of including that as an essential album was it was a kind of textbook case study in the comeback of a heritage artist, but it was also a really, really good album, just on its own, and one certainly I feel everybody should hear.
Oh, strong agree. Have you seen him in concert lately?
I saw him. Would have been last summer when he made his annual trek through, and no, they're still great. He still has a great band together. I think it's tremendous that he's made an album with the original guys again. That's
Yeah.
going to come out with July 25th. The Revenge of Alice Cooper, and I've heard it because I've been doing journalism on it,
Yeah.
and it's a great record. Talk about a band that hasn't lost a step. But Alice as a performer is just a freak of nature. I
Yeah.
mean that he's doing what he's doing at now, what, 77,
Yeah.
and he'll go till he drops or till the guillotine he malfunctions. I just feel like he really will, because you talk about, so why are these guys still around? And the thing that comes up is often they don't need the money, but that's not the point. The point is it's for a lot of these artists, this is their life's work. This is what they do. It really is. That's not romanticizing it. It really is what they do. It's why the Stones they're making a record right now, and they'll be back on the road next year, assuming everybody is able to. That's you don't lose your muse, and you don't lose your Jones to make music. You just don't. So and I'm glad for that, because it's nice that a kid in 2025 can still go see Alice Cooper or Judas Priest perform on stage, or any number of them. Paul Simon's still out there. Sting is as good as he's ever been. David Byrne's coming back again. I really do think it's important in a that when they're around, it's not eat your peas and carrots. It's eat your candy and ice cream, because it's
Yeah.
still good.
100% agree. Yeah, absolutely. I always appreciate, that these guys are still out there, because so many of them, perform at a high level. I mean, I saw Alice Cooper a number of times, like, 10 and 15 years back, and I was amazed that he hadn't lost a step, even vocally. His vocals were still very strong.
Yeah, I mean, you weren't talking about Pavarotti,
Right, yeah, exactly.
yeah, to begin
But it's
with,
still
but
gravelly,
he's he's
it's unique.
yeah, he's able to maintain, the vocal style that he created for those songs.
Absolutely. Okay, the last one I got here for you harkens back to our last conversation. Our guy, Bob Seger. Bob Seger, Against the Wind, is included in this book. When you were here, we talked a little bit about what he was doing in the later part of his catalog, and I know the 80s was kind of that period where he started to downshift his release schedule. But you said something very interesting to me about The Distance, the 1982 album, and what a strong record that is. And since then, yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. That is a great frickin' record. Against the Wind makes it in the book The Distance, and Like a Rock don't. What is it about Against the Wind that really sets it apart from those other two?
Well, first of all, it was a huge, huge album. It was, his Grammy-winning album. It also was the template for the Seeger transition from, that 70s kind of rocker, even though, he had a few ballads then, but, he really started to achieve a new and different kind of balance with what he called the mediums, meaning medium tempos of Fire Lake and the song Against the Wind itself, and still having the rockers in here, like Her Strut and what's the other one I'm thinking about? He still had rockers as
Yeah.
part of the albums, but this was more of the Bob Seger we were going to see for the next whatever it was, almost 40 years that he continued to be a recording artist. So that was just when you, as much as I love The Distance and still do, when you stock up the whole story of the 80s, this was the one that had to be in there.
Well, I gotta say, I commend you on putting together a book that focus, that narrows it down to these 501. There was really nothing in the book I took any exception to, and not a whole lot that I felt was left out that even as a fan I would have argued about. But it's so interesting. If you go on like TikTok and Instagram, you can find people who are like 80s influencers.
Yep.
Like they dress up. Like I hope every one of them gets a copy of this book so they can, expand their knowledge of that era, because there's a lot of great stuff in this.
More than that, I hope every one of their followers gets it.
Yeah. Well,
because we do want to do a 70s book.
I was going to ask you about that. What's next?
Well, we need all the good. I'm working on something else that'll be announced down the line. It's not as mysterious as I'm making it sound. But if all the good people listening, buy their 80s and 90s books, we'll get a crack at the 70s. I've already started that spreadsheet, and that's going to be an even greater beast to whittle down than the 80s was, because again, you had significant bands recording and releasing significant albums a lot. I mean, which Led Zeppelin album are you not going to have in that book? Yeah, but we want to try. All the contributors are ready to to go. So hopefully we'll get the chance to do that.
If these sell as well as you hope, how deep into time can you run with this series?
Well, I think there's a good 80s or a good 60s book to be had, and that's probably it.
Yeah.
If 501 is the number, and then I think we can obviously go into the 2000s, the 2010s, even though those weren't album decades and album wasn't the primary means of consumption. There still were enough albums to have a list of essential albums for those decades. But 70s would be first on the agenda.
Oh, very cool. Okay, well, then I guess the only thing we should say, what is the best way for fans to get this book, and where can they find you and your articles?
Okay, well, to get the book anywhere books are sold, and we do always put in a plug-in for our independent bookstores to go there. If people are ever around Detroit and see me tooling around, honk and pull me over, and they're in the trunk of my car too, and you laugh, but they really are.
That's great.
I sold a couple at my softball game the other day. And then to find me, it's, let's see, Graff on Music on X, or Twitter if you still call it that. Real Graff on Music on Instagram, Gary Graff on Music on Facebook, and Graff on Music on Blue Sky.
Very cool.
And a picture on your local post office wall if you ever go there.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Gary, just like last time, this was an absolute blast. Congrats on the book. I think it's really well done, and I enjoyed reading it.
Well, thank you, and thank you for truly a wonderful chat about it. Very, very thoughtful, and I always appreciate the effort that goes into preparing. When I can tell there's a lot of effort that goes into preparing, I deeply appreciate that.
All right. Well, thank you. Whenever your next project is out, as long as it's music related, or even if it's not, come on back. We'll have another chat.
Always happy to.
Hey, thanks for listening. There's no shortage of great content out there, so you choosing to spend some time listening to this show means quite a lot. If you're so inclined, please give this podcast a 5-star rating and a positive review wherever you get your podcasts. And share our links wherever you can. Or mention this show to anyone you know looking for a podcast recommendation. All of this helps us out a great deal, and I appreciate it. You can connect with us on social media too. We are at Play That Podcast on Facebook, Threads, Blue Sky, and even TikTok. Or we are at Play That Rock and Roll on YouTube and Instagram. Please post a comment and say hello. Finally, Play That Rock and Roll is a proud member of the Pantheon podcast community. So if you're looking for more music podcasts beyond this one, trust me, start with Pantheon. You won't be disappointed. Otherwise, I appreciate any and all efforts you take to support us here at Play That Rock and Roll. Be sure to join us next time for more great music and stories from the world of classic rock.